Hello, welcome back to Fear of Missing Out. Welcome to the ICA if you're just joining this evening. I am soon to hand over to Judy Wajcman, who will be discussing the theories laid out in her new book, which you see here, Press for Time. We have around an hour for that session, and Hito Steyerl will chair the Q&A. This will then be followed by a presentation by Olea Lialina and Karen Archie, who will be in conversation, again for around 40 minutes, allowing us around 15-20 minutes for a Q&A chaired by Hito. Thank you for coming. Please keep your questions to the end. And Judy, can I invite you up? Please welcome Judy. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I must say I'm just so delighted to be here. I've been a fan of the Institute for 30 years. I've been coming here, and I never thought I'd be cool enough to be invited to come and speak here. It's my very first time, and I'm absolutely thrilled. What I'm going to talk about today is this book I've written about technology and time, and I've been interested in this relationship for a long time, and I've been particularly intrigued in recent years by the discussion about how life is speeding up. That everyday life is accelerating. And it seems to me that this discussion, this discourse of speed up, is a dimension of FOMO, actually. It's part of the same kinds of discussion. Excellent. Digital technologies are now ubiquitous. I mean, we're all talking about this. We've now got 24/7 connectedness, and there's a new awareness of multiple possibilities of many things we can be doing. And this makes us always feel like we haven't got enough time to do the things that we want to do, that we're always trying to save time, that we often feel rushed. And what I want to do in my brief session today is just to raise some questions, actually, about the acceleration of time and also about the acceleration of technological innovation. Now, if we believe the cyber gurus of Silicon Valley, this speed and connectivity is a good thing, it's a wonderful thing, it's going to make our lives better, more efficient, we're going to be able to do things faster, simultaneously. If you think about all the time-saving tools that are sold to us, like Siri and Cortana, all of the ads for these things show people doing multiple activities. You know, they're always somebody jogging along, making appointments, chatting to friends, doing all sorts of things, all really driving a more efficient life, making the most of time. And I think this is very much the case if you think about the iWatch, which is the kind of latest iteration of this. And I always find these things, I don't know if you can read it from there, very interesting. What it says is, we all share the same hours, minutes, and seconds. What happens during that time is different for everyone. So the Apple Watch doesn't just keep accurate time. It allows you to see time in ways that are most meaningful to you as individuals. So as usual, we have here absolutely a mass production product, but is sold as being individual, personalized, just for us. And we know that all of these things come with multiple apps that allow us to do many things. And now we can measure, I read now that we can not only measure our heart rate and how fast we walk, but also sleep patterns. And I think most insidiously, actually, kind of moods and happiness. And there is now a whole happiness industry, how to maximize happiness. And that if you can sort of log these things, I mean, I read this piece the other day, you'll be able to sort of use the bracelet to sort of feel happier, to kind of adjust your moods as well. Now, what's particularly interesting to me as a sociologist, as a social scientist, is that it seems to me that acceleration isn't just a lifestyle trend, but actually, if you read the commentaries on post-industrial society, the knowledge society, the smart society, the postmodern society, there's a whole range of theorists now, all of whom are telling us that we're now entering a new temporality, that time is really changing, whether it's, and they've got various concepts for this, timeless time, instantaneous time, various conceptions of this, but what all these theorists have in common really is that they describe industrial time as linear. They talk about clock time, the beginning of industrialization, the emergence of clocks, assembly lines, industrial workers, and that we all had this linear notion of time measured by the clock. And now we're kind of morphing into this new period of time-space annihilation, where everything is simultaneous and we're in timeless time, I-time, a new kind of time. And all of them really see speed as somehow our quintessential sort of postmodern condition. And although these theorists vary a lot in what they have to say, I think what they really have in common, and I mean this is going to be my theme in a way, is that they all see this new contemporary timeless time as driven by technological innovations. It's all very much a technologically determinist theory of time. Now, what I think is particularly interesting when you sort of reflect on this is the paradoxes that it throws up. Because if modern machines save time and make things go faster, how come we feel time pressured? How come that we feel that we're not in a leisure society, but that we're in a very rushed society? And you often hear that it's like Alice in Wonderland. We're running faster and faster to stay at the same place. So really what I was interested in the book was to try and unpack some of these paradoxes of time and really examine the idea, for example, is the pace of life speeding up? What's the role of technology? And why is it that we vacillate between, on the one hand, blaming all of these technologies like social media for this speed up, and yet turning to these very same devices to solve the problem? And how did acceleration actually come to signify the zeitgeist, the sort of contemporary modern condition? Now, if you read any of this literature, the tenor of all of these theorists is that somehow this new kind of timeless time is actually destructive. And there's an avalanche of books that come out. I try and keep up with these books. I sort of buy all these books. But there's heaps and heaps of books of these sort, all saying that this speed up is absolutely terrible, that we're completely addicted, that we're overwhelmed. And there's lots of books advising us now on how to deal with this hyperconnectivity, how to deal with this addiction. I was on a panel recently with two people actually, and the two people after me, the first one after me was selling a breathing app, so he talked about that, and then the woman next to him was doing mindfulness, and so it was like, we're in this terrible place, and we need these people to get us out of this place, and these are kind of the solutions you get. And I've been particularly struck by the fact that Sherry Turkle, who I'm a great fan of, and maybe some of you have read her book, she's been a commentator at MIT for years on what cyber life is doing to us, what digital technology is doing to us. And she too has finally written a very negative book saying that actually social media is hollowing out our relationships, that there's a lot more noise, but that somehow there's less meaningful communication. And Tim Wu, who writes a lot about net neutrality, also has recently been speaking about the fact that there's an attention deficit and that the resource that business really have to focus on is gaining attention. And the standard solution, as I've said, is somehow to go off the grid, lock up the machines, and return to a more authentic, natural state. And even somebody like Morozov, who's such an acute critic, talks about the fact that when he wants to sit down and write his fantastic blogs about the digital society, he goes and locks up his machines. And so this is just one of my silly slides, but I saw this last year, that New Forest National Park, which for those of you who aren't Brits, is a park here that people go to for the day off, that they had set up a tech creche, and the ad for it was that you could go along to this place and you could put your digital devices into the creche, and the ad said, you and your family can surrender your digital devices and car keys and skip off for a tech-free family day in New Forest. Enjoy activities from days of old, like chatting, making eye contact, not Googling things you wonder about. must all have feelings about people who do that at the dinner table and say, well, Google later, just look at the damn birds. Actually, this is, you know, I often go off on tangents, but I can't resist this one because on BBC 4, literally 2 days ago, they had somebody on talking about how they should make bird songs now part of the national curriculum and that this would really transform kids' relationship with nature. Actually, I had some sympathy for it, but I did think it was part of this whole kind of genre. Now, of course, we're all aware that the solution isn't simply parking our devices. And in the book, I argue that this contemporary imperative of speed is as much a cultural artifact as it is a technical one. I very much believe that the kinds of technologies we get, the kinds of devices we get, reflect society as much as shape society. That actually we only get the devices we get because they're appropriate, they're timely to the kind of times we're living in. And that's what I'm going to show you in a minute. So when I think about technologies, and I'm in a field in sociology called Science and Technology Studies, and when we do our studies and talk about the relationship between the social and the technical, we think about technologies as crystallizations of society, if you like, as frozen social relations. And we talk about the fact that actually it's not that the technologies are out here and society's here, but we actually co-evolve with our technologies. And so it's important to think about the kinds of machines we have because they're part of how we live. And particularly, I think, to question the notion, which I'll come on to in the latter part of the talk, that the fastest technologies are necessarily the best technologies. Okay, before I go on, I just want to remind you, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, that we're not alone in considering our period, our contemporary period, as somehow, you know, uniquely experiencing unprecedented technological change. When I was writing the book, I did go back and look at the historical work on, you know, the railways and the telegraph and all of those technologies of a century ago. And I was really struck, and you would be too if you go and read that material, of how much discussion there is there of the collapsing of space and time. You know, how the experience of being on the train completely altered people's perception of space and time. How the telegraph, there was one of the books I read, a description of the telegraph was literally saying it would ruin language, that it would simplify language, that people would just be sending messages that were incredibly short. And I just thought it's exactly the sort of Twitter discussion, you know, that we have. And this is just a quote from Lord Salisbury that I was very struck by when I was reading it, because it seemed to me, here he is actually talking about globalization in 1889. Now, there's quite a debate amongst economic historians about whether the changes of the last century, of the turn of the 20th century, were more or less radical than the changes that we're going through now. It's a sort of big debate, and a lot of economists talk about this. And for example, Martin Wolf, who's the economist for the Financial Times, is very much a believer that, you know, the railways and electricity and that these technologies were much more profound than the web. And so there's a sort of endless discussion about this. I think it's a rather sterile debate, and I'm sure you've all seen, you know, these images. And I think that I only put them up here because I think it is useful to just recall for a moment that actually we have had similar debates before. And I think it's important before we go on to look at what's different, to recognise and keep in our heads that you know, we've always been going through these periods of technological change. We've always been having sort of debates about, you know, fear about the technologies and what they're going to do, and utopian aspirations about electricity being magic and bringing in a new world. So I think the sort of dichotomous debate that you get all the time, actually, between whether these technological changes are brilliant or terrible, has got a very long history in utopian and dystopian discussions. And so I just sort of wanted to make that point before I sort of go on to talk about the contemporary, just sort of very quickly. Okay, so what is different and what's the same? And I guess the other point I want to make before saying that is I also think it's important to realise and have an awareness of the fact that we live with old technologies as well as new technologies. I'm sort of very struck by when people want you to speak about technology, they're always thinking about the latest thing and the newest thing, and they don't want you to talk about electricity and the landline and all of the these technologies here that we're all sort of living with that are very much embedded. Actually, the new technologies are very embedded in old technologies, and that brings with it possibilities and constraints as well. But as a sociologist anyway, I'll just give you, I'm a numbers person. So Ofcom, for example, have just produced a report where they actually have accurate figures, and they say that one big change in terms of how we're living is that we spend a lot more time on screens than we do sleeping. And so if this is the case, if we're living in this era where social media are everywhere, where technology is everywhere, is it right then to blame these technologies, these digital technologies, for accelerating life? I mean, is actually the pace of life faster? I think it's worth questioning this, and I think actually that the answer is yes and no. It's not an easy one. I mean, on the one hand, if you survey people will say that they feel there's less time. The general thing people will say is that they feel rushed, they feel pressed for time, there's a sense that there's less leisure time than there was before, and that life is more hectic. However, if you actually look at proper sort of data over a period of time, what you find is that the amount of leisure over the last 50 years, I mean a decent sort of time period, that actually there haven't been huge changes in the time people work, people sleep, and the leisure time they have. Now, of course, it's true that between different groups, there's huge variations between the overworked and the underworked and unemployed, etc. There are huge variations between groups. But historically, there is a lot of consistency in terms of the amount of leisure time people have had over the last 50 years. And what it makes me think is that this gap between the objective time people have and their subjective experience of it isn't to do with the amount of time, but to do with the character of time. How are technologies changing the character of time? And I've been researching the impact of technology on social life for many decades, and what I've learned from this, pretty obvious thing to say, is that technologies don't just speed up things that were there before. They don't just speed up things, actually they change relationships, they change activities, they change the world is, and that we change in relation to them. And so I think it's worth thinking about technological acceleration as going hand in hand with new activities, new relationships, new ways of being. And having said that, I think it's very important to stress that technologies don't have a life of their own. They only come to life as we integrate them into our lives. And I feel sort of still hopeful, although I was very taken by Peter's talk, if you were here 2 talks ago. I feel hopeful by the fact that all of our historical work on technology shows that technological change is always unpredictable, always contradictory, it never goes in one way, that people always find ways to use technologies in ways that were unanticipated by the designers, and that we can never predict how we're going to use these technologies. I mean, I was lucky enough recently to be interviewed with William Gibson, and he was saying that if he'd written Neuromancer in the 60s and had people walking around glued to their phones, no one would have published it. Like, nobody could have dreamt that this could be possible. So it seems to me that the very same devices that can make us feel very out of control and rushed, we can also incorporate and integrate into our lives that give us more control of time. And I think studies really do show this. So what do I conclude from this? The first thing I conclude from this is I think this narrative about acceleration, and it could be a narrative about FOMO as well, that everything is sort of accelerating, I think is far too one-sided. And I think it gives far too much power to technology itself, as if we're just determined by technology acting on us. And if you think about our everyday lives, I think our everyday lives are very much characterised by a multiplicity of temporalities, actually, depending on who we're with, what we're doing, what the context is. Sometimes can feel very intense, sometimes can go very quickly, that there's a lot of different rhythms, I think, in terms of how we live, not this overarching narrative of speed. And the example I like to use is the one about quality time with kids. Again, the narrative now is that people aren't spending time with their kids, that they're always on the phone, da-da-da-da-da. Actually, again, if you look at the data, what you find is that we're living in a period where people, meaning mothers and fathers, are spending more time with their children than they ever did before. And not only are they spending more time, but they're spending what we call in sociology, in these surveys, active childcare, that they're actually talking to their kids more than they ever did before. So I think you can think about some periods of time being more intensive while other things are going on. And so I like to think about this as really a dialectical interplay, if you like, between technology and time, that some aspects of life might be speeding up, some might be slowing down. I mean, let me just talk for a minute about, I've done a lot of work, again, on mobile phones. I started working on mobile phones when they were new, believe it or not. When I started working on them, they were considered to be a business tool. That's what they'd been designed to be. And people very quickly started using them to contact family and friends and their kids and all these other things. And I can remember, actually, in the early days, all of the journalists saying, you know, that people were abusing the phone, that this isn't what the phone was designed for, this was an abuse of the phone. And I think a similar thing can be charted with the move from Blackberries to smartphones. I mean, the take-up of smartphones in Britain has been absolutely incredible. I mean, now more than 2 in 3 adults own one. I mean, an extraordinary number of people own them. And what do they use them for? Well, you all know, you know, for texting, taking photos, information services. Apparently in Britain, in particular, people use them as an alarm clock, much more than in Europe. I don't know why this is, but I found that kind of intriguing. And I think why this technology has become so ubiquitous, a technology that was designed as a business tool, is that it fits into what we think about as a de-routinized or de-synchronized society. Now, what do sociologists mean when they talk about that? What they mean is that we're no longer living in a 9-to-5 society, that we're no longer living in a society where people go to work at particular times and come home at particular times, listen to the news at 7 o'clock. Most families are now dual earner families, trips are very complicated, there's a huge amount of synchronizing to do now in everyday life. And it seems to me that that's really the context in which smartphones have come into their own. And those structural changes, I think, are very much the cause of busyness, not the technology, but all this synchronizing activity that people need to do to get together. So I think that my point here is really that the issue is not so much a shortage of time when people talk about these things, but I think a problem of timing or scheduling, and that smartphones are a great device in these contemporary times for those reasons. I spend a bit of time in the book arguing against the notion of people like Sherry Turkle that communication has got worse. I don't think this is the case. I mean, this is the usual cartoon you get, as if nobody's communicating and everyone's on their phone. Actually, again, if you look at the research, what you find is that people are using these technologies to stay connected, people want to be connected, and I've talked about in some of my writing the mobile phone is a tool of intimacy and a very important tool for that. Now, what about email? You're all thinking, surely she's not going to say that email is contradictory, we all suffer from information overload, how can email be anything but a terrible thing? And again, just to tell you about the sort of studies we do in organisational sociology and in management schools, I think what's very interesting about email is that email has somehow become a symbol for overwork. That when people want to talk about having to work harder and faster because there's less people doing the job, because there's new performance systems, because there's all sorts of regimes in the workplace, all of these things are sort of hard to articulate. Whereas if you go back at the end of the day to your inbox and it's full, it's very easy to think that that's a great source of the stress. That somehow there's something about the asynchronous timing of email, the fact that it accumulates when you're not there, that's made it very easy to become a symbol, I think, of overwork and overload. And I'm very people say to me, well, what should we do about this? What are the sort of solutions to this? And I think, again here, what's very important to stress is that the reason that we're answering emails quickly is to do with collective norms in the workplace, that we have all colluded in this business of answering our emails quickly, and that we need collective policies to do something about this if we want to do it. And I like to quote the examples from Volkswagen and Daimler in Germany, the car companies that have brought in through works councils some policies that try and collectively, as a workplace, ban email at the weekend. And the famous one from Daimler that everyone loves, is the one that says that they put up on workers when they were on holiday. And so if you email somebody on holiday, the message that came up literally said, the person you're emailing is on a holiday, your email will be deleted. If it's really important, email them again when they get back from holiday. And, that would be a sort of revolutionary policy in terms of sort of time making. Okay, so I've argued that we're not just sort of passively victims of these machines, that we're actually very actively engaged with these machines and collectively deciding how we're going to use them to some extent. But does it matter what sort of machines we have? Should we at all focus on the machines and think of the machines as somehow complicit in our sense of time pressure? And as a sociologist of technology, one of the things I've been trying to do for many years is to say that I think it matters a great deal what sort of machines we have. And what I want to spend my last few minutes talking about is I think that our cultural expectations of speed are very much being fed now by innovations. That our cultural expectations of speed are being fed by innovations. I said at the outset that I think technologies reflect and express our times as much as shape them. And what's so important about the sort of technologies we get and how they're imagined is that when we think about the future, when we think about a different kind of politics of how can society be, we think about these things through tools and technologies, that actually our very visions, our utopian visions of what we can do, rely very much on these technologies. And it seems to me that that's why it's incredibly important that we're much more discriminating and demanding about the kinds of technologies we get. What sort of technologies do we want? What purposes are they going to serve? Because otherwise we're just left with a politics of sort of consumption as consumers. This new technology comes along, we like it, we don't like it, but it's there. We haven't been involved in the research and development. We haven't been involved in the decisions about whether we want this technology to be developed at all, like drones, that there are all these technologies being developed and we're always on the back foot just responding to them. And I think we much more actively need to be engaged in the processes of technological change. Let me just sort of explain what I mean. I think sort of one of the areas in which we've completely bought this story about acceleration is in relation to technological innovation itself. That the sheer speed of innovation is taken as progress. It's equated with inventiveness, productivity, efficiency, that we really think that the better technologies we've got, the faster we'll be able to do things, we're going to be able to save time. And it seems to me that we're so caught up in a culture of busyness and hyper-productivity, that it's very hard to step back from these kinds of ideas and think about whether speed itself should be the rationale for innovation. I mean, are the best technologies really the most efficient and the most automated? Is that really what we want? I mean, certainly if you go to an engineering school and you ask engineers, they will certainly say that the fastest, the latest, and the most automated technologies are the best technologies because, of course, they talk about human error. The more you've got humans involved, the more the things supposedly are error-prone, so the most automated is the best. But let's step back and just think for a minute about things like even searching the web. On the whole, people just think Google is fabulous because it's so fast. It's the speed of the web. We think, how fantastic, we get this knowledge really quickly. But we rarely step back and think about the algorithms involved, the kind of knowledge that we get. I mean, I used to give a lot of talks on gender and technology, and one of the stories that I would often tell is how Google had to change its search engine. Because this is a few years ago, when you typed in "she invented," the autocomplete used to literally come up with the question, do you mean he invented? So there was a campaign and they changed that. But my point is not that it's deliberate gender bias at all. My point is that algorithms always reflect the values and cultures of the world we inhabit. They're always influenced by whoever's designing them. And I think there's a real problem in this common assumption that Wikipedia, Google, that all of these websites are sort of neutral brokers of knowledge. Now, I popped up to the Google headquarters, which are just up in St. Giles, and I said to them, why is this autocomplete so important? Wouldn't it be better to have more accurate knowledge? Wouldn't it be better to have lots of different search engines that maybe were designed by different groups of people, like, you know, a lot more women and other different groups, and then you might have different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of information and different kinds of data, and they educated me about the concept of latency, which is speed, that the most important thing is speed. And didn't I understand that even if there was half a second's delay on the search engine, which would occur if you increased the results on a page, they said from 10 to 30, it would cause a 20% drop in traffic. So, you know, there's a lot being sacrificed in the name of speed and in our desire for speed, seems to me. Let me just give you a sort of another quick example, which is the constant upgrading of hardware and software. I'm the sort of person, and it probably shows my age, that I actually went into the Apple shop with my iPod to try and get it repaired, and the guy looked at me and said, 2 years old, madam? We can't repair anything that's 2 years old, like I'd come from another world. And my point is here that I think a lot of what's taken as innovation is actually trivial. It's trivial upgrading. It's not really what I would call innovative. And the flip side of it, as we know, is a pile of trash, e-waste, huge amounts of trash that is the other side of what's known as innovation. And I also think that what's interesting and important about this politics is the notion of repair. That actually there's been a few campaigns, and these are all sort of small things, but a few campaigns in relation to these companies that have been very much trying to raise the issue about trying to have designs of technologies that are easier to recycle, that are easier to repair, and that what the companies on the whole do, because of course they're profit-driven, is to sort of glue things and stick things and try and maximise how much, you know, the inbuilt obsolescence is. I mean, inbuilt obsolescence is a very old theme for us old lefties who've been studying capitalism for a long time, but I can tell you that I never dreamt that things would be obsolete in 3 months and 6 months. When we used to talk about this, we were talking about long periods of time. And the sort of turnaround now, I mean, if anything's accelerated, it's the turnaround of these products, which is extraordinary. I also think that in terms of the discourse that these companies put out, What's very much left out of the discussion is the time actually people have to spend buying these things, learning how to use the new software, getting the stuff fixed up, the armies of people who are doing work cleaning up the web, that the story that we get is always of the innovation, of the hero, that the technology story is very much a heroic invention story, and it's not a story that takes into account the whole life of technology. And we sometimes talk about this as digital labour, both paid and unpaid. But all these things that are going on that allow the infrastructure, if you like, to sort of exist and reproduce itself and carry on. And it's made very invisible, I think, by this sort of heroic discourse. Now, let me be just absolutely clear with you. I'm not nostalgic for old technologies, for a more natural, less digitised past. I'm not at all lamenting lost times. But I'm not, on the other hand, I haven't embraced the slow movement, slow food, slow science, mindfulness as the solution. I'm very much with a feminist theorist called Donna Haraway, who always said that, techno-science has got amazing emancipatory potential, like science, like we've always thought. Technology can be liberating, science can be liberating, but we've got to be there and be critical. We've got to be absolutely engaging with it. And I think where I'd like to start with this process is very much to interrogate what genuine inventiveness is. That inventiveness isn't just about speed and novelty, but it's actually about challenging the assumptions of our scientific discourse. And to put it very simply, all I mean is that we should start with social problems and then look for the technology rather than the other way round. And the contemporary guise of this, I think, is the big data story, and social scientists are absolutely running at the speed of knots to get involved with big data because there's going to be huge government money put into big data research. And it seems to me that that's a sort of classic where people want to do the big data and then find some problem that they can direct it to rather than thinking about the problem the other way round. And I think what gets clouded in that is that actually even doing big data is in itself a political act. That, there's a lot of politics in doing particular research of that sort that's very much covered up. Now, it seems to me that it's very difficult to do any of these things if the people who design our technologies and decide what's made and what's not made are so unrepresentative of society. Think for a moment about Microsoft, Facebook, Google. All these companies are basically engineering companies. And whether it's in the US or Japan, they employ very few women, very few minorities, very few older people. I'm told by people who work there that this is absolutely accurate. I haven't actually seen this, but people say to me it is. In the UK, for example, I think it's completely staggering that only 7% of engineering professionals are female. It's the worst in Europe, the worst practically everywhere. Jesse Jackson has been campaigning in the US about the fact that there's very few American blacks, African Americans in Silicon Valley. I think it's 1%. And apart from the fact, the sort of equality and diversity issue, the point I want to make is that if a very limited type of person is making technology, the kinds of technologies they're going to make are going to be very limited. That actually you need a broader range of people involved with thinking about technology to get a lot of different technologies. And just to give you two very crude examples to finish with, everywhere I go now in these companies, people talk about the Internet of Things. The huge new market is the Internet of Things. And they tell me that it's going to be absolutely wonderful, that you'll be able to control your heating and lighting on your smartphone, and that your smartphone will tell you what's in the fridge and when it's going off, and won't this make life much better? And I think two things about this. I think to myself, well, who's going to cook and wash up? Of course, as a feminist, I think that. But also, there are the data implications of this, which we've been talking about quite a lot today already, so I won't go into that. I just wanted to put this up for you because the other thing there's a lot of discussion about, and there's a session tomorrow I noticed on robots where we're going to see some robots. As you know, there's a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence and sociable robots. And this one here is HRP4C, Humanoid Robotics Project 4 Cyborg. And the only point I want to make about this, it's a Japanese team who are doing this, is that this doesn't look very radical to me because actually this robot is designed on the dimensions of the average values for young, attractive Japanese females. And I noticed, this is sort of slightly off the tangent, but there was a piece in The Guardian just a couple of days ago, in fact, with the chap whose name I can't remember, who's doing the robotics session tomorrow. Yeah. And towards, and it always starts off with a discussion about looking after old people, and it always ends up with pornography. That article too, yeah, I just thought. And I always think, oh, Jude, how can you go there? And then I just think, well, actually, it's not me that's going there. Which I think, again, reflects just the imagination of people who are making these things. I mean, my point is that I think these futuristic visions like this are actually very conservative. I don't think they're radical. I think they're conservative. And I think they're not even beginning to imagine alternative social relationships and alternative ways of living. And I think really the future on offer in these kinds of things is a future where everything changes, but actually everything's exactly the same. It's like everything changes, but actually what's really changed? It's that sort of thing, like what is so radical about this technological change? So just to conclude, I think our sense of time has always been shaped by technologies, whether it's the clock or new technologies, that our very sense of time has always been intimately tied up with these timekeeping objects, with the sort of technologies and objects that we have. And I'd argue against the notion that somehow digital time is radically different from this. Seems to me that we need to understand it, like all technologies, as the product of the way we use the technologies, the way they're designed, the way we integrate them into our everyday lives. And that if we feel pressed for time today, it's not because of the technologies per se, because of the social media, but because of the priorities and parameters that we're setting ourselves. Thank you.